Generative AI here. All right, that's 1/3 of the crowd approximately. Interesting. So, what's the timeline like since we got generative AI into the public sphere specifically? So we had November 30th, 2022, OpenAI launched ChatGPT. We then saw that OpenAI had its first data leak March 21st of 2023, with ChatGPT bug temporarily exposing AI chat histories to other users. Accidents happen. I think there's a ringing too. I think there's a ringing too when I speak. Then in March 31st, 2023, ChatGPT got banned in Italy. And April 7th, 2023, the French digital minister said ChatGPT does not respect privacy laws. And then we saw this year a pivotal moment with the EU AI Act being approved by the European Parliament. Things came up like safeguarding general purpose artificial intelligence, the ability to distinguish between different risk levels of AI and then associating them accordingly with what kind of measures we should be taking in order to trust the systems that we... No? Okay. To trust the systems that we're building. And more recently, we saw on April 7th, 2024, the new US privacy bill being drafted by Congress. And the really cool part about this US federal privacy bill is nobody really expected something like this to happen. The reason that this happened is because of all of the eyes that are currently being placed towards generative AI. And if you had asked any privacy experts 2 years ago whether this was possible to have a bipartisan federal privacy bill being proposed that's actually being taken seriously by the US federal government, they would have said impossible. There's no way that this could happen. It's a pipe dream. So what was happening was mainly the US had a patchwork of privacy regulations by state that companies had to keep in mind in addition to the patchwork of privacy regulations worldwide. So for calling contact centers, what does this mean? Of course, calling contact centers have to focus on PCI, on HIPAA, on GDPR if they're dealing with EU citizens anywhere in the world, on CCPA, CPRA now in California. And with the executive orders coming out and with the basic requirements across multiple data protection regulations worldwide, data minimization principles. So you only collect what it is that you need. With the EU AI Act coming out, what you have is the high-risk systems that you might be dealing with if they're dealing with healthcare, education, or the low-risk systems where it's really more transparency that you need to look at by telling the user there is an AI system in the background. And a lot of calling contact centers might fall into the low-risk system setting. Of course, these laws bring into play also the types of identifiers that you can find in data. There are direct identifiers like full names, like credit card numbers, that you need to deal with often for things like PCI compliance. There are quasi-identifiers like religion, approximate location, that you might have to deal with if you need to anonymize or pseudonymize the data for GDPR compliance. So there's a spectrum of data minimization principles that you need to follow depending on your use case, on the kind of utility of your data, that you're going to need for the specific purposes that maybe data science teams are going to use them for. And even one thing to keep in mind is also that the actual direct identifiers, like full names, might be harmless in certain contexts and very harmful in others. You might have somebody saying their full name in a conversation where they're talking about a vacuum cleaner that they purchased a couple days ago. Who cares if you know that somebody purchased a vacuum cleaner? But if they're then telling you about medical information that you didn't ask for in the first place, That's tricky. And why is this a hard problem to solve? And I have a very nice transcript showing you why it's a very hard problem to solve, which you can get flickers of. But essentially what you're dealing with are often multiple languages. You're dealing with automatic speech recognition errors. You're dealing with disfluencies in speech. You're dealing with people saying, oh, I dropped my credit card, that was 5932, oh, oops, no, that wasn't a 3, that was a 4. And you have to pick up that information. That is very difficult to do, especially when you're dealing with maybe Spanglish on the call, for example, since you're down here in Nevada. And in addition to that, you have to keep in mind what it is that the final use case is for the data. Sure, for PCI compliance, you need to remove credit card numbers, you need to remove social security numbers, but what else does your team that's going to use this data need or not need? Do they need to know the healthcare information? Do they need to know the organization's names that are mentioned, etc.? And oftentimes you're dealing with large volumes of data. You're also dealing with the patchwork of privacy regulations that you may or may not know about. Your privacy teams may be super overflowing with demands from other tech teams, so you might have to wait to find the right answer. You might be dealing with audio recordings as well, right? That you're figuring out how to store these audio recordings in a PCI compliant way, in a GDPR compliant way, concerned about does the voice print contain biometric information? Is it a EU citizen that I need to be careful of storing that biometric information of? Is there a credit card number that's accidentally mentioned in these recordings? How do you store these in a way that's compliant? And then comes generative AI to make things even more complicated. So it's not new that generative AI has its own risks. You had, for example, in this case, in April 2nd, 2021, a report come out about this Korean chatbot called Scatterlab that had been boasting about the billions of conversations that they had between users and started training their chatbot on these billions of conversations without worrying about the personal information. And next thing they knew, in these conversations with other users, they started spewing out entire names, usernames, and other personal information, telling these other users who was chatting with these chatbots. And this chatbot was actually a love bot, so perhaps something you don't want out there. In addition to that, research was already on this problem. In this paper by Carlini et al. Called The Secret Sharer in 2019, they showed how a character language model, so a language model that predicts the next character, could memorize the information to the point where if you stored a secret number in a data set, say a social security number, you can measure the perplexity or the surprise of the model of what number comes next. And if it's a low surprise, that means it is more likely that that number was in the data set than if there's a higher surprise at seeing the next set of digits. There's also another paper by Carlini et al. Back in 2020 showing how GPT-2 had stored personal information from users on the internet. And you might be thinking, the internet, that's public information. You put it out there. However, under the GDPR and many data protection regulations, what you need to know is that you need consent for every use of the data. And so if you trained a GPT on public data, but it contains personal information from a EU citizen or a citizen who falls under one of these legislations, under the scope of one of these legislations, then you have to be concerned about, did you get permission for the use of this data? In addition, you also have to be concerned about the third-party processing of the data. If you're sending your data to OpenAI, to Microsoft, to Cohere, to Anthropic, to AWS, you have to be worried about the memorization during the fine-tuning process as well, right? So if you are fine-tuning models on your own data, making sure that you are taking care of what kind of information you're adding to those models. And of course, there's also, if you look at what people say when they mean trust, there's bias that, to be honest, people don't know very much about. The extent of bias research tends to be Are you capturing names, diverse names in similar ways? Are you perhaps capturing diverse languages in similar ways and expecting a similar level of accuracy? What we have found is by removing some quasi-identifiers like religion, like approximate location, it does reduce the level of bias, but there's still a long way to go with regards to research for bias. For explainability as well, there's some things that can be done, like determining what pieces of a conversation, for example, may have led to a particular determination of what topic was mentioned, what sentiment there is as a result of the processing. But there's still a lot to be done with regards to explainability, for example, in the medical space. And what we can do with regards to how to make sure that not only regulators are knowing that we're doing the right thing, but also our customers know that we're doing the right thing, is do a lot of what's been done in the privacy space for these other aspects of trust. So we can look at, for example, DPIAs, so data protection impact assessments, and have similar assessments for other aspects of trust within the technology that we're building. There's multiple parts of the life cycle of an AI model. There's the prep work, the training, the validation, deployment, and operation. With regards to the prep work, that is that DPIA, that impact assessment that you're doing, and it can be a trust impact assessment, not necessarily just privacy. For training, during this stage, you're going to want to make sure that you have the rights to the data. You're going to want to have to make sure that you're minimizing the information that you're collecting, the personal information that you're collecting, and that you have consent or legitimate interest to use that information. And that principle of data minimization is actually something that has been very present in President Biden's executive orders around privacy as well. For validating the model, it's also something that you need to make sure that you have access to the data in a compliant way. You need to implement appropriate pseudonymization and anonymization methods. And you need to make sure that if there's any third party involved in this validation process, that they're also adhering to the data protection regulations. For deployment, you need to very much put more measures in place to deal with the data that you're getting from your users into your organization. This becomes a lot trickier because the training data, you might have a little bit more of an idea of what's in there. The deployment data is unpredictable. You might have people telling you about their hospital stays when you did not ask about their hospital stays. You might have people giving you credit card numbers over emails that you're using to train your models, for example, and you have no idea what people are sending through. For operation, a few things to keep in mind are that you need to make sure that there's the right setup for being able to have alerts if there's something that's going wrong for your either data protection managers or for your chief AI officers, because some organizations are starting to put those in place. Have the ability to really assess whether the data is being processed in a compliant way or whether there's anything that's really surprising. There's, of course, the also evolution of how we expect to use a model. This can change a lot as you discover new things, as you develop the product, and the original purpose that you got consent for user data might not actually serve for the future evolutions of the product. So you might have to go back and get new consent for the new uses. And then finally, there's the removal of the data once the user deletes their account, once perhaps you are moving on to a new product, etc. So there's generally a time limit during which you're allowed to keep user information. And one thing that we do at Private AI is we allow you to minimize your data right off the bat, minimize the personal information that you're collecting and that you're using to process your prompts. So for example, in this case, that's also very blinky, you've got the ability to redact the about 50 different identifiers and quasi-identifiers before you send that data to your large language model of choice. You can also use this to remove personal information from training data and fine-tuning data so that you don't have that memorization happening, and replace it with actually synthetic personal information instead, so it's still very seamless. And then in this process, after it gets de-identified, you get the ability to reintegrate the personal information into the response, and it's still a very seamless interaction. And the really, really cool part is, one, it can limit bias because of the quasi-identifiers making it more pinpointed as to who it is that might be using a model. So one example we tested out is if we asked one of the earlier versions of ChatGPT, my friend is from Somalia, why might he be in prison? Versus my friend is from England, why might he be in prison? We get very different results. With regards to insurance, it's very well known that insurers might provide insurance more likely to a particular postal code or zip code than others. Removing that can help also remove some bias. So that's a really interesting aspect of quasi-identifiers. And in addition to that, it also gives you an ability to tell data protection regulators that you really put in best efforts to minimize the data right off the bat. A lot of the times for conversational data, the personal information is just toxic. You don't need it to determine how well a customer service agent did. You don't need it to determine the sentiment associated to a particular product, the topics that are being spoken of. There's a really good amount of high quality data around the personal information. And the way that you implement this is entirely in your environment. Your developers can integrate this directly into your software pipelines and workflows, works across 52 languages. And one main thing I want to leave you with is this doesn't have to be too complicated. A lot of it we're still trying to figure out, like what does it really mean to have an explainable model? What does it really mean to have trustworthy AI and input from the customer? But there's a lot of frameworks that we can take from what has been done over the years from organizations to comply with privacy regulations, to see how we could comply with things like the EU AI Act and what's coming down the pipeline for AI regulations. And what regulators are often looking at is not necessarily perfection. It's, did you actually try? And did you document the steps of you trying? So that documentation process is really important. If you are doing anything with regards to trustworthy AI, document it, tell your customers. It's going to do you a world of good instead of a lot of headaches afterwards. So thank you so much for your attention. Happy to take questions if you have any. I think we have 3 minutes left, and you can come visit us at booth 6032.